Hi, good evening everyone. Welcome to the problem solving session 13 for conservation geography course. And this is the last problem solving session for this course. And as I had discussed in the previous session, that today will be just a second. Yeah, so like I mentioned in the previous session, that today will be the last session for this course. Over the past 12 weeks, we have looked at different topics individually, all the modules and their chapters, and we have looked at several questions, several topics. All these were very vast topics that were covered. So in this session, because it's a summary session, I'm going to summarize the entire course and give you some mind maps for your revision when you are doing it for the exam. Because I just have the 2 hours to complete the entire syllabus, I will be touching upon the important topics and giving you a direction of how to go ahead. And unlike my problem solving session, which I have done in the previous weeks, I will give you questions. There are questions, 10 questions for each of the modules. Unlike my previous problem solving session, where you have for each lecture of that module, we had 10 questions. And so this is just 10 questions for the whole module. And you have the answer to this questions will not be given right after the question. They will be towards the end. That's because I want to discuss more on the topics that are there in the other slides. But when I'm asking the question, I'll explain you why the question is there and what is the importance of that question. And you can always, because there will be recording, you can always go back to the recording and stop the video where the question is starting, and then solve it, and then go to the end and see your answers match. That I had to do because I am on time constraint, and unfortunately I won't be able to cover a lot of things that are very important. But I hope that I will be able to give you a mind map of how to cruise through the course. Right. So in this course, over the past 12 weeks, we have discussed 12 modules. Each module had 3 lectures, so 36 lectures. In my problem solving sessions, we have discussed over 300 questions for all of these different lectures. And broadly, if you look at the topics that were covered in the course, they were conservation geography, of course, as the name suggests. But then we started to look from Earth, how did Earth form, what were different layers in Earth, and what was the different importance of these layers and landforms on Earth. And then we moved from an Earth perspective to a more specific perspective, where we looked into all these aspects with relation to India. And then once we had covered about Earth, about India, about biodiversity and their conservation, we moved to human perspective, which is equally important for understanding conservation. So we did human population. Just a second. So we looked at human population, we looked at several aspects related to human geography and economic geography, and we also looked at why they are important from conservation perspective. So let's begin with the first module. The first module, if you remember, it was about introduction to the course, and there were 3 lectures in this. The first was about the need for conservation, where we looked into what is conservation and why do we need conservation. Second was geography and conservation. So we looked at these 2 terms independently first, like conservation and geography, and then we put it together, and to understand why is it important, we looked into how they are actually formally defined. And the third lecture was about biogeography, which looked into the different biotic phenomena that are differentially distributed in the planet. So we're talking about plants, we're talking about animals, we're talking about all different kind of species that exist on the planet Earth. Why are they present where they are present, and what are the processes that define or guide their presence there? So let's begin with the formal definition of conservation. Conservation, as the word, consists of 2 terms clearly. It consists of con and surveyor. This is the first thing that we had discussed. So con and surveyor, if you break down the meaning, it means together, and surveyor means to keep. So you're together trying to keep something. The key something here is environment, nature, and the important clue word here is together. That means that we cannot work in isolation. We have to work with everyone around us for conservation to happen, and we have to not only think about ourselves but also the other beings that are around us, right? Now conservation, you should very clearly remember, is not the same as preservation, protection, restoration. These are similar terms, yes. They are also concerned with restoration, is also concerned with like keeping the integrity of a region, preservation. But preservation, protection, restoration together make up conservation. But there also you have preservation alone is something else. Protection, restoration has to come together. And this is not similar to environmentalism and ecology. So, as you can see on the slide, preservation means it allows some places or creatures to exist without significant human interference. So, preservation is you are keeping it pristine, you're not letting any human intervention there. But for conservation, the most important thing that you need to remember is that for conservation, you need human intervention. You need people to be actively taking part so that you can, promote the existence of these different species. That's how it's different from preservation. Talking about environmentalism, that talks about the assessing the impact of people on environmental quality. Now, environmentalism, as the name suggests, it's only about the environment, which means about environment quality. How does that environment look? What are the constituents? What are the proportions? That doesn't look into the effects of, or it doesn't care about or look into the preservation, protection, and restoration. It just assesses what is the impact on environmental quality. So that's not what you're doing in conservation. And ecology is basically, as a standalone field, is study between organisms and their environment. That gives you the basic information. But when you put into action and take measures to upkeep those interactions, that's conservation. So these preservation, environmentalism, ecology are similar terms, but you need to remember they are very different from conservation. One very important thing in this course is over the 12 modules, you have several formal definitions. It's I'm not suggesting you to mug it up, but what I'm trying to suggest you is you need to be very particular when you define a thing in this module, in this course, because each word used in the definition there has a specific meaning, and that's why they are there. So one word up and down would mean something completely different, and you will see a lot of instances in the slides and in the problem solving sessions in the lectures. So that's a tip, so please be careful when you're revising. So here, right, we are talking about preservation and protection. Protection from what? Protection from human impacts. Humans have overused the natural resources, and that has led to many problems which require immediate attention. If not, we will be at a position where we might even lose these natural resources. So when we say things like this, what are the impacts that we are trying to highlight? We are talking about overconsumption, where you are overusing the natural resources. We are talking about climate change. We have extensively discussed this in the problem solving sessions and in lectures. You have changes in soil, changes in biodiversity, all these and several other important impacts. These are all very important human impacts. They have very, very drastic effects on the natural systems and ecosystem, and we need to be careful about these, and these are what gets highlighted when you're talking about conservation. Now, conservation we have understood, right? Conservation is to upkeep the something with the help of others. But what is geography? When you look into geography, the first thing that will come to your mind is geography is studying whatever organisms and landforms and whatever you see around us. But that's not just what it covers. Geography has different perspectives, different subfields, and as you can see here, it talks about human through population geography, political geography. You can change the unit from human to any other unit, let's say a group of animals in a particular region. But geography encompasses a vast field, and this becomes important when we are looking this from Anthropocene perspective. Why? I'll tell you. Because when you're studying about geography, you're looking at the interactions and how they are present and why they are present and what's happening there. Just a second. Yeah. So when you are looking into the anthropology, so why it becomes important is because during Anthropocene you have this bloom of population, human population, and humans have used resources in such different ways that now it is creating a problem. So all the impacts that we saw in the previous slide, they became more prominent during this era, Anthropocene. So when we are talking about conservation geography, you study geography with an Anthropocene perspective and then look into the conservation measures. And it's exactly what has been followed through all the different lectures that we covered in the different modules. Now that was about geography. So let's see what exactly do we study in geography. So we study about the different patterns of, one second. Just a second. Sorry. Yeah. So when you talk about geography, you're talking about what are the different patterns found in the different regions of Earth. Where are these features located and why? So what are present? Let's say you are looking at a region. So what are present there? In that region, where exactly are they present? And why are they present here? And when you see this or study these aspects, you get to know the factors that affect the distribution of biogeography. These factors are called pull factors and push factors, and very intuitive to understand, right? Pull factor are basically factors that pull organisms towards that region. And what would be such factors? Factors that make their living better. So good climate, plenty of food and water, absence of predators. These factors hold true even if you look at humans or if you look at animals. That's why it's important that you understand this in the introduction itself. And the opposite are push factors. If factors are not something that conform to this good standard of living, the organisms move away from these places. So this is what kind of, these are the things that you study when you look at geography or when you look at biogeography with the perspective of living organisms. So now you have this information that they are present here. They are present because of these regions. They are present here because they are adapted to these kind of features. Now you study this from an Anthropocene perspective. You look at human impacts and you see how they are impacting human survival. And that's when you take the conscious effort of conservation and making these changes. You cannot blindly start about thinking about going with conservation until you know the geography and know the biology of what are you trying to conserve and how do they sustain. So that's why this entire course is trying to highlight, and that's what we have studied. Now, like I said, geography and conservation, when you put it together. So, in geography, what, where, and why. You also put it in conservation in the same perspective. Just when you ask what are the issues of conservation, if the most prominent issues will be loss of biodiversity or habitat, then you see, okay, these habitat, these are the problems. Where are these problems mostly associated? And you will see that they are mostly associated. Yeah, I was about to just a second. Yeah, sorry about that. When we're looking at geography and conservation, you're looking at questions like what are the issues? Now, where are these issues mostly present? And you will see that they are mostly present around human habitations because we're looking at the changes from Anthropocene perspective. Now you see why are these issues being there? What are the relationships? Why are human even trying to do that? What are the issues and why are they coming up? And then how can we resolve? And you will see this when we'll study something called sustainable development. What exactly are we referring to? So, well, that's the broad topics that was discussed in the first module. Now, I was mentioning at the beginning that I will have this set of questions, but I don't have the answers right away. The answers will be there at the end of the problem solving session. So when you are doing this or when you're looking at this video again, you can read these questions, take a pause, answer, and then match your answers with the key that is given at the end. But I will explain you why these questions are here, and with that I will explain you what is important for you to study. So the first question here is about laws. So, like we know, right, that there are pull factors, there are push factors. There are also certain laws that dictate why a species is found where it is found. So, we had in the course, in the lectures, we had discussed two such laws. So, remember those laws; those are important from biogeography perspective. We have looked at the laws. So, there will be two questions. One will be here, and one will be in the next slide. So look into the laws and what exactly determines the biogeographic distribution. Next, you have, so I was mentioning this, that let's say here, study of economic activity and factors. This is a very particular definition. So you need to know which definition they are talking about, and this, because the exam will be from a perspective of 36 lectures, so you need to be very clear about this. Okay, and the next question, third one, is about push and pull factor. So you need to read and remember which one is what factor. Fourth, look at the fourth question. The fourth question is conservation is preservation, protection, and something. So you need to be clear about that, and you cannot write, let's say, rehabilitation and restoration means two different things, even though the amount might seem similar or sound similar. So you need to be exactly particular. Next is hippo factor. So hippo factor was something that we had studied at the very first lecture. It does come up in my chapter today's session towards the end, I'll tell you how do we connect it. But you also find hippo factors in the beginning of the course. Hippo factors are all those different kind of human impacts that we analyzed when we were looking into the different kind of impacts that affect the natural system. So hippo, remember what is hippo, remember this acronym, remember the full form of it, because they are the major human impacts that affect the natural system. Okay, then the next set of questions, organisms secrete or exude certain chemicals. This is about interaction between different species. You need to remember which one is what. Predation, competition, allelopathy, mutualism. There are many other set of interactions that a species does with species that is sharing the habitat with, and that influences their distribution. For example, let me give you an example. Let's say a predator, from a predator's perspective, it generally is found where the prey is more in number, right? So you find more concentration of that or more density of that animal at that region where its prey availability is more. Now look at competition. Competition is when two species, let's say, are trying to fight for a region. Here, whichever wins stays, the other moves away. So this also impacts the density of the location, and that's also creating the biogeography. So you need to be very careful which species or which process are we talking about here, right? The seventh question highlights what I have been speaking about. You need to be very careful about which word we are talking about. See, this says permit human interference. So in which of these do you see the interference of human is acceptable? Eighth ones is similar to what we saw in the second question. This is about the type of study of geography. So you will see in your lecture that when we had seen geographical study, there were two approaches: systemic and regional. It's basically what unit you are studying, and but again they are very very important as to what are you trying to study. Ninth question looks into again the law. This, so there were two laws this were discussed, and both the laws are in both these slides, and that gives you a good revision. And the last one here is about how do you form value it, or how do you calculate what number of impact has happened, how much impact has happened. For that there is a formula which looks into what is the impact and what is the density and how long it has been used. So that was also discussed in the problem solving sessions and in the lectures, right? So with that we finish this introduction, and let's move to the other topics quickly so that we can finish it up in time. Yeah. So now let's begin to look into what this course started with. So the first thing we looked in the course was about Earth. So why Earth? Because to understand current relationships between organisms, you need to understand what happened in the past. And for exactly that reason, just a second, I'm sorry. Yes. So when we are talking about current relationship, current interactions, it only makes sense and gives a better interpretation when you do it with perspective of what happened in the past. And what better to understand in the past than to begin with the formation of Earth itself. So here we started with first looking at how Earth evolved, when did it originate, how did it evolve. Then we came to the structure of the Earth, what are different layers of Earth, and then what are the features in those different layers. So, of course, everything is very concise in today's session, but let me just walk you through what exactly we discussed. So, we discussed that first we looked into the universe. From there, we looked into these different planets that we have, for Jovian, for terrestrial. From that, we moved into Earth, and then we looked at how Earth begins. Earth, we saw that Earth began with a molten matter, then different processes led to cooling of the temperature. It started with very high temperature, then the temperatures cooled down, then gravity played role, so it made all the heavy materials come to the center, and then you have these three differentiated layers which are called crust, mantle, and core. And all these three layers are very important. You have several features which are in part of each of these layers. Just a second. Okay. Yes. So this is what I was talking about. These are showing the different layers of Earth: crust, mantle, core. There is also this layer called asthenosphere, which I will discuss when I discuss the question that I've given. Then you have these different spheres: lithosphere, and remember hydrosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, biosphere. All these are the different layer, the spheres that we are talking about, where you have different features. But this here is just about the three different layers of Earth. Now, when you are talking about Earth and its development and past, you have the geological time period, and this geological time period has been divided into several different units. You have eras, you have epochs, you have periods, you have ages. So all these different names that I just took, classification, they are all important from different specific events like extinction, mass extinction basically reduced the biodiversity by a huge number. Then there was the first invertebrate that came onto the planet, the first mammal, the first marine life. So of course it's too huge, but there are some very specific example given in the lectures. So when you read that, these are from there, so be very careful of what we're talking about. I'm not discussing all of this, but you can see that I have already shown you that there are different names here. There is period, Triassic period, Paleozoic era, Pliocene epoch, Paleozoic is the current eon, Archean period, and Cretaceous. So these, as you can see on the right hand side, they are each with their different characteristics. All of these, just a second. I'm sorry, I have attended all the videos. Never shows some weeks or attention partially how this could be. Okay, sure. Vinay, I will take this up with the courses. I'll try to mail them and check. But you, on your regards, could also mail them and check once. I'm pretty sure they would respond to you. Right. So that's about geological time period. Okay. Now, this is important. This topic is very important when you look into the second module. This talks about the plate boundaries and the continental drift theory. So when you are doing about Earth evolution, this is very important. This tells you, let's say, what is divergent plate boundary, what is convergent plate boundary, what is transform plate boundary, and which of these gave rise to what landform, and what does it lead to. There is earthquake, there is volcanic eruption that are related to these tectonic movements. So plate tectonics and all the subsequent topics are very important. Please revise them vigilantly. You will see the next topics are those. So when you do volcanic eruptions and then earthquakes, both of these topics are also extensively discussed in the problem solving sessions. So you have volcanic eruptions. We have studied about a different kind of volcanic eruption. How are the lava coming out? How are they spreading? How is the magma forming? And then we also looked into earthquake from similar perspective. So earthquake has actually multiple layers into it. So earthquake, where did they originate? How are the waves forming? What kind of earthquake it was? What was the source? So these are not difficult topics individually, and they are very simple. Just when you are revising, do remember to have a look on this. And of course, I have 10 questions that gives you a mind map. These 10 questions are again summary of all these different topics here. So as you see here, the first question talks about correct order. So crust, core, mantle are definitely 3 layers, but they are in a very specific order. So you read it from left or read it from right, it should be in a particular order, right? Second question is what I was talking about. We have looked into different volcanoes. If you remember, shield, calderas, composite. So you need to remember what type of volcano is this and the others with respect to their structure and the way their magma flows. Third, this is about asthenosphere, and asthenosphere is important from the continental drift theory, where we are talking about that, the plates. There are plates, not the continents don't move alone, but continents move because of the plates that they are connected to, and the plates are present on the asthenosphere of Earth. So asthenosphere, plates, and plate tectonics are all interrelated and very important. Fourth is from a geological time period, so be careful when you look into that. Fifth is continental drift theory came later than other theory which suggested why do you have these 7 continents. So continental drift theory is supported by various kind of evidences. Few evidences should be very clear and very obvious. First is, if you look into the different continents and put them together side by side, they fit exactly with each other, and that's because earlier they were connected to each other, which is called Pangea, and then they broke apart. So that's one. And then you have fossils which are from different regions, but they are same. Then you have animals which are found in different regions. Maybe their fossil is somewhere else, but they are found somewhere else. So those kind of evidences support continental drift theory. Okay. Then this 6th one talks about earthquake. This is just there for you to revise. 7th also talks about plate boundary. 8 talks about asthenosphere is part of a layer. It's not a separate layer in itself. It's important from plate tectonics perspective, but it is part of which layer. If you see the 9th and the 10th, these are also talking about earthquakes and structure of the earth, and they are about topics which pertain to their details. For example, earthquakes, I told you they form different fault. So which kind of fault? We have looked into strike slip. If you remember in the lectures, professor had shown these different models, and they had shown what kind of faults was forming. If there is oblique slip which moves up, if there is strike slip which goes down. So two plates coming together, and then once they are when they come together and they strike each other, what kind of faults happen? And the 10th one is about how did we even know about these different structures and all these different information. There are direct and indirect source. That's what you need to do. Not a difficult topic, but the most important topic here is about the plate tectonics and the topics later than that. So when you're revising, do be extra mindful of these topics. Okay, quickly moving to the next set. The next 4 to 5 lectures were about all these different spheres. So we looked at different layers. Now we are looking at different spheres. Spheres means we are looking at atmosphere, which is talking about air. Hydrosphere, which is talking about water. Lithosphere is talking about land. So everything around us was covered in these different lectures. Atmosphere, which is covering the air above us. The hydrosphere, the water around us. Lithosphere is what we are standing on. And biosphere is everything on that land and water and around us. Okay. And in between, we look at all these 3 perspectives, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, from a inner perspective. So the first in this or the next three sessions, which is about lithosphere and hydrosphere and atmosphere, all have this similar pattern. So don't get confused or overwhelmed when you're looking at these lectures. They are all basically starting with what is that sphere, where is it present, what kind of components does it have, how did it come to be, and then what is the current state of those forms, and few aspect of conservation. So there's this clear pattern in each of these modules. So when you're revising, just look each of these modules from this perspective. So let's start with lithosphere, which is about land. So here we start with rocks and minerals. Lithosphere is mainly consisting of rocks and minerals. There's a clear distinction between rocks and minerals. So you need to remember which one has like defined properties and which one doesn't have a rigid property. So cue for you to remember which one is what, and that's one of the clear distinction between rocks and minerals. And then you have different kinds of rock. When did it form? How did it form? And these examples that you find on this slide are just few of the examples that were given in the lecture. So try to remember few of them. Similar with minerals. So minerals break down and give rise to these rocks, these debris. These rocks don't have defined composition, minerals do. And that's why minerals become very important when you are trying to remember the names of it. And these are the different kind of geomorphic process that has given rise to the different kind of landforms that you see around us. Endogenic and exogenic are the broad category. Exogenic is something from outside. Endogenic is something from within the earth. So within the earth, we can imagine it's volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and all these different. But from outside, which is exogenic, it is about weathering. Weathering is about moving of winds and changing the landform. Mass movement like avalanche, you can imagine avalanche happening and that's moving. Erosion, that's taking away the first layer of soil. And then there are transportation and deposition, so for example, sediments and the river beds that you see. So these are what is happening in all this process. The kind of landform that you see changes around you. So these are the different processes that were discussed. And when you do finally look into the landforms, which is what is the outcome of all these different processes, these landforms are also divided into two categories: depositional and erosional. Deposition is basically accumulation of sediments, let's say. Erosion is removing, so forming a cave or forming a hole. So when you look into an image, when you read a name, it becomes apparent that whether it is erosional and land depositional, which one of either is this. And these are the landform, and these are the agents that have given rise to those different landforms. Running water, still water, which is groundwater, ocean or ocean waves in particular, glaciers, ice, and wind. And you can imagine if you have wave and the wave is continuously, coming and falling on a rock, the rock breaks away after a point of time, and that gives rise to a different kind of landform. Similarly, wind takes away half of further top layer of the soil, or it can break the structure of a rock that gives rise to different kind of landform. So when you are looking into these different landforms, in questions it will become apparent that all these different agents have their own depositional and erosional landform. So that is something that you can look into. But broadly remember that there are these 5 agents and there are these different kind of forms that are there. So when you revise this question, I can see all the questions are something that I've talked about already. So you have a question which talks about which mineral is this, so you need to be careful about that. It's talking about what kind of, so they see this question, valley is an erosional landform. So here you can have 3 kind of question. You can have this agent with you and what kind of landform is built, or it can be told to you that this is the agent and this is the landform, but what kind of landform is this? Or it could be this is the agent, this is the kind of landform I'm talking about, erosional, what kind of landform do you think will make? So 3 layers to this particular topic. So that's why when it becomes a bit more important when you are looking into the other topics, when you're looking into this module. Similarly, here you have these different types of landform that are formed and several definitions. So be careful. There is this eighth question that is important. So when I talk about rocks, I did not talk about these three types of rock: igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. I am sure you remember it very clearly. You have had many problem solving sessions and the lectures for this. But what you need to remember is all these three rocks are interrelated to each other, and there is a step, there is a cycle of these rock formation. One of these comes first, then the other, and then the last one. So that you need to remember, and that's following a logic. So something comes out as magma, and then what happens? It's all very logical, but yes, don't miss out on these rock cycles. So that was about the land on which we are standing. Next is about the atmosphere. So when you're talking about atmosphere, again the same perspective for the structure of the atmosphere. Now, for atmosphere, if you're talking about process, you're talking about weather, you're talking about wind, so you're talking about atmospheric circulation. And here the next topic was about climate, which is the most important and most talked about topic in these days, which is climate change. So you know weather, you know what is the climate supposed to be, and then you see it's not following this trend anymore. So then we try to understand why did this happen in Anthropocene and how can we tackle that. So we have seen layers of earth. In atmosphere, you see the different layers of atmosphere. Basically, the sky above is the troposphere. There are many more layers above it. So you have stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, all these different kind of layers, each with their own property. So mesosphere is where you see the meteors. Exosphere is where you have the spaceships station. Thermosphere is where you have all these satellites that we had read in the last module, which was GIS, if you remember, remote sensing module. You have different satellites. These are placed in the thermosphere. And then you have stratosphere, where you have the flight that we take, right? And all these different layers or spheres that we are talking about, they have their own width, thickness, own temperature, and own properties, what kind of composition and what kind of density they have. So that's why just looking at these layers, you can say that there are several layers of atmosphere which have their own properties. And then you look into the composition of each of these atmospheric layers, and what you see around is that it is dominated by nitrogen and then several other gases in different constituents. So you need to, maybe you can remember in this way, which are the most common and most prominent and what is there. Just one second. Yeah. Coming back. So you are looking into the composition of atmosphere. So what are different gases? And along with gas, remember these two components, water vapor and dust particles, which are also part of atmosphere. And very clearly, it has been discussed in the lectures that why dust particle is there in the atmosphere and water vapor. And then this is what is the most important topic in this module: air masses and fronts. Wind is moving, but wind is basically air which is moving. So what kind of air moves or what kind of air is circulating? There are different namings for that, first of all, and there are different types of each of them. First, you look into air mass. Air mass is basically talking about what kind of wind is flowing around you, what kind of air is flowing, and that is determined by two properties: your moisture content and your temperature. So dry or moist, warm or cold. On the basis of this, you have these different kind of air masses. On the slide, you can very clearly see where each of these different kind of masses are present. You can pick a region and you can see, let's say tropical. So you see more of moist and hot. You go to extreme Antarctica and Arctic, you see more of continental Arctic, dry and very cold air mass. So this air mass classification is something that you should remember. And then following this classification, you need to remember the fronts. Basically, you're trying to understand which air is overtaking the other air. So is a warm air replacing a cold air, or a cold air replacing a warm air? Be careful with the terminology, which one becomes a warm front, which one becomes a cold front, and when two fronts overtake each other, which kind of front does that form, or which kind of boundary does that form? So these are two things that you need to be careful in this module. And then comes with, when you are already reading about the directionality of the winds and the air masses, this also will become very apparent to you. Global wind patterns, what kind of wind directions are placed in different parts of the earth. And with that, there was something related which is called global conveyor belt. So this topic, uh, you need to remember, it's important because it's basically talking about how the temperature is maintained across the earth, different parts of earth. So that topic was global conveyor belt. All these air masses, air fronts, wind patterns were all together and they form one single unit. And then we switch to climate and climate system. Basically, here we start with why is climate changing, and it's very obvious. I mean, I'm pretty sure that we keep hearing about it, that there is more emissions of greenhouse gases, which leads to the increase in temperature. That's we know. But now we need to take a step further, and just 1 minute. Yeah. So, so you already know about what is driving the climate change. We now need to look into the different changes that is coming with because of climate system changes. So climate change is leading to what kind of problems and impacts. So you can see this is a nice image which summarizes all these different drivers and changes and the impacts. So this is what was discussed also in the lecture. Now moving ahead, you would see this pattern or trend in the lectures, that whenever a problem has been highlighted, the very next section was about how to tackle those problems, how to come up with the solution for this problem. So here for climate change, we highlighted what are the issues about climate change and how do we go ahead with it, and that's called mitigation and adaptation. So you mitigation is basically you trying to take measures for not letting the thing happen. So you're trying to tackle, or you're trying to better all the so causal factors that leads to climate change. And adaptation is basically not making any change but adapting to the current situation. So these are two different approaches. There's a flowchart, logic flowchart, which determines if you should go for mitigation and adaptation, and this comes under climate change, and we have of course discussed this multiple times. So in this module, this we do touch upon climate change and all this mitigation, but as the basic, you should first remember the different kind of air masses and fronts. And the questions that I put here on the slides also follow the same pattern. If you see just quickly over the questions, they're all questions that are already discussed in this brief summary that I have provided. The first question is something that I didn't touch upon when I started, but it's very it was the first thing that we had looked, right, that not our earth gets its temperature, its heat from the sunlight, but not all of the sunlight is retained. Most of it is reflected back. So how much and how are these different percentages coming into effect? There was a very nice image and which we had discussed. So I'm just telling you all this with reference to the problem solving session as well as the lecture, so that you can easily go back and follow those lectures. Um, and if you remember, when we were talking about atmosphere, hydrosphere, we were talking about isobars, and we had looked into all these different kind of circular figures. So those basically were talking about how are these circulating. So please read them. They are not, like I keep mentioning, they're not difficult, but because you have studied it few weeks earlier, it might look that it's very much to cover. The next one was something which was discussed in climate change module, and we had looked into different kind of responses, and this was one of the image. So the image should tell you what kind of response we are talking about. And the other three questions are again similar to what, or covers the topic that we have just discussed, right? Okay, so let's move quickly to the next chapter module. That for this atmosphere was similar to what we did for lithosphere, and now we'll do the similar thing for a hydrosphere, where we will look into the different structure, different composition, and the processes in hydrosphere are basically the water movement and ocean movement. And then we will look into hydrological cycle, which is very important for hydrosphere, which is basically recycling of different forms of water over the planet Earth. And we need to know all of this because this is what gets impacted as climate change happens. So in hydrosphere, we looked into the different components, which basically is talking about where all do you find water on planet Earth. So you have ocean, you have ice, you have groundwater. These are all different kind of water as well, right? And that's because they have different process. As you can see on the right side, oceans have evaporation, ice have snows, which only come into existence or they are discharged from the component by melting or sublimation. And then you have groundwater, surface runoff, and atmosphere. Atmosphere, if you remember water vapor, this is what we are trying to talk about here. And then comes something very important here, which is about the ocean floor. If you remember, we looked into landforms of the lithosphere. There are similar forms on the hydrosphere as well. So you have on the ocean floor, you have major features and minor features. I will tell some names which you might be able to recollect. We were talking about seamounts, abyssal plain, continental shelf, continental slope, trench. So this is basically when you start moving from the land into the water, what kind of landforms do you see? And we looked into how were these formed and what is their importance. And these are the minor features, and this again some more that we had discussed: mid-oceanic ridge, Guyot, seamount. Mid-oceanic ridge is also very important from continental drift theory perspective. So looking into this is a good idea because you get to understand a lot of other features associated with geography. And like we had read about the air fronts, there is also about ocean currents. So you have cold current, warm current, all this conveyor belt, all coming into action together here. And lastly, you have the hydrological cycle where you look into these different process, right? You have precipitation, sublimation. Basically, we are talking about water from the hydrosphere to atmosphere back to hydrosphere. How is this happening in its natural form? So what are we trying to highlight with all these different cycles? Why are we reading this event? What all these three lectures were trying to say was that if left alone or if used at a sustainable rate, these different spheres or these different earth resources can replenish themselves. They have their own cycle to do that. But it's only when humans overuse them, these cycles get impacted, and that affects the availability of these resources for humans in the future. So that's why understanding these basics becomes very important, and that's why the earlier few modules were all about basics about the planet Earth. And then, because I just spoke about why is it important from conservation perspective, we then looked into the importance of hydrological cycle, not only for replenishing the water, but also for several other phenomena. So if you see one thing which is a very common thing in all the lectures here, all of the topics are related to each other, and there is a lot of redundancy in the topic. So once you do one topic clearly, the others become easy for you or become additional points to that topic. So I will be, if you keep listening to me, it will sound like I'm saying the same thing again and again, but that's only because all these topics are related to each other, and it's only when you put it out on slide or in front of you, it becomes apparent that they are all very similar to each other. So importance is basically, as you can see, they are helping maintaining all the different currents that we had just discussed, about the weather that we have already discussed, about the natural resources that I discussed in the first group. And then, like I said, we also looked into how we can go ahead with actions to conserve them, right? And now in this you have several questions. Let me look into some topics which I haven't discussed. From the sense of it, it looks like I've discussed everything except for two, which I will come to it in a while. So rain and tides is what I haven't discussed, but these are all part of movement of water. So when you are looking into ocean current, subsequently you will also come across tides and waves and rainfall. So these are all different kind of ocean water movements. So, and they are not difficult at all. So if the questions here basically cover their topics that you need to remember. Similarly here, if you see, all these questions are basically talking about the topics that I have already discussed right now. So if you look into these topics when you are revising, it covers the most important topics that you should need to remember from these lectures. So you could use this as a mind map. Now, like I mentioned, before we move to the biosphere and talking about all this interaction between organisms, we will look into all the three layers that we discussed about air, water, soil from Indian perspective, because we are also interested to understand this from our country's perspective, right? And when we did that, we looked into three different forms. First of all, for the Indian context, we first looked into the physiography and structure of India, not the political, but the physical and the geographical. And then we spoke about climate. So we want to now look into what is the climate of India and is it changing and what are the different habitats because of that. And then we looked into the water systems and drainage systems of India. So if you look at India and the geological regions of India, you have three regions. So you have the northern mountains, which is the Himalayas, and then you have the foothills of Himalayas, which are the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and then you have peninsular region. Now, what you need to remember is which one is older. So I will ask you which one is older, peninsular or the mountains. And if you thought towards peninsular, you were correct. If you thought Himalayas, you are wrong. Himalayas as mountain came up very recently as compared to the peninsular region of India that is there. So peninsular region are older than the Himalayas, and that's why understanding geological regions is important. But that was about geological region, the broad three regions that you have. Among these three regions, you have different kind of divisions based on the climate, based on the temperature, based on the vegetation, based on several other phenomena. Those six are northern mountains, northern plains, peninsular. Along with it, you have desert, coastals, and the islands. And I am sure you already get the image of why are they different from each other. So, wait a second. Now, all these different kind of divisions that we have spoken about have different kind of trees, have different kind of weathers, different kind of temperature, different kind of humidity, and that gives rise to different kind of biodiversity. As you can see here, if you go to Jammu Kashmir, you see alpine meadows. Come down to Uttarakhand, it becomes moist deciduous forest. Go towards south, you will see a scrub forest, and go towards the west, you see sand dunes. And these are just very few habitats that I could discuss today, but all of these have been extensively discussed in the problem solving sessions. So please do go back and look into them. Once you have habitats, you also need to remember the rivers, which are basically giving water to these regions. So there are few rivers, but most of the rivers have many tributaries. And to imagine that all these regions in the country have to get water, there are these different tributaries that flow. Why are they, where are they flowing, and how are they flowing is what this topic in this lecture we had covered. We looked into different kind of drainage patterns and what were the different rivers. You need to be clear about, there are two types of river system. When you're talking about rivers of India, there is peninsular and then there is Himalayan. So remember which rivers are part of which of this system, right? That tells you where are the rivers located. And then You also need to remember which direction the rivers are flowing. There are only two. Most of the rivers flow from west to east and some flow from east to west. There are only two that follow different patterns. So you need to be that, at least you should be very clear about and remember them distinctly. And when you're talking about drainage, remember 3-4 terms that I'm going to talk. First is accordant and discordant. Brahmaputra is a discordant drainage system. So why is it? And very nicely it has been described. Why is it discordant? Because it's flowing from behind the Himalayas and from the Arunachal Pradesh. So you need to remember this incident, and then you need to remember these different drainage. You will have Nepal as a specific example for one of these drainage pattern. So remember the drainage pattern, the shape of it, and wherever there is example, at least remember the most prominent ones. Yes, and then summarizing all these different topics that we have read for India, and begin with the conservation issues, basically highlighting the issues that are currently there once we know the resources that India has. So you see, mining, dam construction, overfishing, and the over sprinkling of water or overuse of water in the fields. These are all few of the different kind of conservation issues that were highlighted in the lectures, and we also looked into what could be done for them. So I put this here for you to remind that we looked into conservation issues for all of these slides, but as I mentioned previously, they are interconnected, so they should not be much trouble for you to remember. Like I said, the first question itself says what I just told you a few minutes back. You need to remember Nepal, what kind of drainage pattern it has. There are only few examples that were discussed, and this is one of them, and the other being Brahmaputra mainly, right? And the other questions, if you quickly look into this, they are all already covered except for this Bhabar. Bhavar I haven't mentioned distinctly, but in the lectures you remember these were part of, so there are 2-3 terms, right? Deccan traps, Bhabar, Khadar. So you need to remember where were they present and why are they important. And the next set of questions that you see here are which of these rivers is not, so this is what I was talking about. You need to remember peninsular and the other river system that we have, and try to understand which kind of forest you have in different part of the world. Now, 8th question, if you look into, 9th question is what I just discussed. 8th question, if you look into, Köppen classification is basically used to identify or classify the different kind of climates that you have around around the world. So, like we did the classification for air masses, we also have similar classification for Köppen classes, and you will have several other classifications in the upcoming slides. So, this you need to be careful of remembering which classification are we talking about. We have Köppen, later you will have town classification. Town is classified in several other ways. So that is something that you need to be careful when you are revising. And then we talk about biosphere. Now that we have looked into India and the other different spheres, basically combining all these 4, we are looking into this module, which is biosphere, where we look into soil, we look into the land that we are on, then we look into the different kinds of life form on earth and the biodiversity which is mediated by their interaction. Few important topics here which are towards the end. So you start with soil by first explaining what is soil and what are the different composition of soil that you have, and then we look into the components of soil, and then you look into types of soil. You know that soils have these different components. First, before even this kind of soil classification, you have the constituent component properties. Remember sandy, loamy, clay, silt. So you need to be clear about these classification, because these classification are based on the PPT isn't showing. Is it for everyone? Can others not see the presentation? It's visible. Okay, so I guess it's the internet issues. Okay, sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's so Before, like I was saying, that before you look into this classification, there is another classification of soil. This is very important, which is loamy, sandy, clay, silt, based on the properties of the soil. Properties which is basically determined by how spaciously their constituents are placed. So you have sandy, which is basically high, the constituent rocks are very high, big in size, and they are placed very separately. And then you have silt and clay, which are very compactly packed. Why is this important? Because this determines what kind of soil properties do you get. Depending on what is the size gap between the constituents, you have water holding capacity, infiltration capacity, smoothness, nutrient retention capacity. Those are important because those tell you about the properties of the soil in and around that region. So let's say here, these soils, they are again based on these constituents and along with their productivity. So this talks about productivity as well. The earlier one talks about the constituent of the soil. So if you pick up the soil and if you analyze it, what kind of component do you get, right? So when you look into the soil classification of India, you have these different kind of soil: mountain soils, alluvial soil, black soil. These soils, when you go back to the lecture and you will see that they are described based on what kind of components they have, where are they present, and what is their productivity. What kind of things can you grow on that soil, and why can't you grow the other kind of soil? Why is red soil called red soil? Why is black soil called black soil? What are the compositions? They are very specific, but they also give you an idea about how why different kind of regions in India have different kind of vegetation and have different kind of product that you get there, right? But before this, before moving into the classification of soil and before moving into the properties of soil, there is something that you need to be very careful is about the soil layers again. Sorry about taking layers and talking about layers so many times, but it's just the same thing in different forms. So in soil also you have different layers. If you remember, there were horizons A, B, C, D, A, B, D, E, and one of them had the parent rock, one of them had the humus layer, one of them was the top layer. So that classification also is not very difficult, and I'm sure we have done it over a lot of time, but that was also there, which is not there in this problem solving session, but it's of course discussed in its previous one. And then what happens in this module is there is a lot of topics that are all back to back, so it might look too much at a glance, but they are each very easy to understand. So once you are done with soil, now you want to know, okay, I know the soil here, but I also see tree here, or I see this kind of herbs here. What led to this kind? Were they always like this here? How did this tree come to be here? So those kind of questions are answered by something called ecological successions, and we had looked into ecological succession from multiple perspectives. One, we looked into this from primary and secondary succession. So that's one classification that you need to remember. Second thing that we read was stages of succession, right? What overtakes the other? So what does it start with, and what does it take? What replaces that community and then finally reaches the climax community? Third, we looked into different places that we are looking into ecological. So we can look into ecological succession in water, on land, in harsh conditions, in marshy land. So there were different places where we are looking into ecological succession. And then we looked into about what changes are, how are these changes brought about? Is it because of interaction among these conspecifics, or whatever is present on the land, or is it because of the other factors? Remember the terms autogenic, allogenic succession? That is what I was referring to when I was speaking. So ecological succession is a vast topic, and we had looked into this topic also from several perspectives. Now, connecting this to biodiversity is basically what we are trying to say here is the climax community that you see need not be the tall branches, tall trees every time, because we are looking at a snapshot of time. So when we do a snapshot of a region and try to understand what is the diversity, that's what we are talking about when we say that this is very biodiverse region and this is not, or this has less biodiversity. So we are just basically talking about the variety of life form that you see on in that region. Okay, and just now I said the words biodiversity rich region and not rich and this and that. How do you say that? How do you define? So with respect to biodiversity, these topics are very important. So please, and these are definitely very important with respect to the course that we are studying. So when you look into species diversity, you define species diversity in two ways. One, you talk about the diversity scale. So you have alpha diversity, beta diversity, and gamma diversity. So alpha can be imagined. Let's say there's a patch of land which is let's say A. So alpha is basically just talking about A. How many different kind of animals, how many different kind of trees, plants do you see? That's about alpha diversity. Gamma diversity is, let's say this A is present in a bigger space around, so in a bigger land place, there is a small patch which is A. So gamma is basically the entire land, how diverse is that land. Beta diversity is the area leaving alpha, so leaving A, what is the unique species in A and outside A. So that's beta diversity. Okay, so that's a very crude way to understand alpha, beta, gamma. So that's diversity that talks about the number. But that doesn't mean that if there is more number of species, or if there is more number of particular instance, let's say species or number, that it is diverse region. That's because there are two interconnected concepts, species richness and species evenness, that comes into play. So species richness is basically counting the number of species. Okay, so let's say there are two lands patches A and B. A has 5 different species and B has 4 different species. So just by the number of species, you say that A is very diverse, but that's just number of species that are present. What about the constituent, or what about the proportion of each of these species? What I mean is, let's say A has 5 species, but out of those 5 species, only one, which is species number A or species number 1, is present on 60%, right? And the remaining 40% of that land is covered by those B, C, D, and E. So the 4 remaining species are only in 10% each. One is very dominant, right? Now, if you go to the next patch, it had 4 species, but all of them equally present, 25%. So which one is more even? Second one is more even. So this is more even than the other one. But the first one is more rich than the other one. So first one is species richness, second one is species evenness. And when you talk about in vague saying it's more species rich, it doesn't encompass it is very diverse. You need to take into both of these account. Now when you say diverse, then you say that it is diverse based on indexes. There are 3 indexes: Simpson's, Shannon's, and evenness. All of these had their formula given, and how we conclude that based on this calculation is this diverse or not. So these is important concepts related to species diversity, right? And so these questions refer to these topics I have covered. Here are 2-3 things that I would like to highlight, which I could not discuss unfortunately in this session today. If you look at the second question, it talks about soil classification again, but this soil classification is for the world, like global soil classification. We looked into India's soil classification. Remember, these were also discussed about the USDA soil classification, which is for the entire globe. So you have alphy soil, inceptive soil, histosol with their own properties. Okay. Third one, which I could not discuss, is about nutrient cycling. Just the way water cycling replenishes the water in our world or even in our planet, similarly nutrients, each of the nutrients, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, has its own cycle in the way that it is captured by the biodiversity or captured by the species on the planet and then released back onto the atmosphere and then again comes back to the planet. So this cycle is where it becomes more important to understand from climate perspective. Let alone used in a sustainable way, this cycle will be able to maintain the nutrient requirements for our world or globe. But when there is a disturb or when there is a disbalance in the cycling processes, this is when the nutrient cycling get affected, right? Fourth is what I was talking about, all the different kind of properties of the different kind of constituents of the soil, right? Fifth, we have discussed already. Sixth, if you see, this is one of the formula of one of the indexes here. Seventh, see the starting place that we have started with. So that determines what kind of ecological succession we are talking about, and then what are the different stages of these successions. I've already discussed this. Eighth is about soil horizon, which I have mentioned that you need to be very careful. Ninth talks about you in soil component you will find rocks. So which are the rocks? So there are only several minerals that give rise to rocks that form soil. So that's why it's easier for you to remember. And last is what we have discussed right now about when you say relative abundance, which of these measures of species diversity are you looking into? Yes, a vast topic, a whole lot of things to understand, but this is important because this is where you lay the base for your species diversity and related topics. Now, this module concludes a section of this course. This talks about conservation of these biodiversity that we have just looked into. So this module concludes your part 1 for this course. In this module, we looked into the threats that are there for each species. Now, after recognizing those threats, you go for conservation. So either go for ex situ, which is taking them out of their place, or in situ is basically keeping them in their place. And then a very human question: what are the benefits from conservation? Why do I even think about conservation, and what is their importance, and what do we get out of it? So this last 1 minute. Yeah. So the last lecture here gives you a very good connection to the later second part of this course, which is about human geography, which is we looked into the benefits of conservation, and then we take it forward and study more about human geography. So the first two lectures are basically redundant in sense that it was already discussed in the first lecture. So you looked into different kind of threats of biodiversity, and you can see, right, all of these different causes are brought about by human impacts. Even the fourth one can be brought about by humans if humans are not mindful enough when they are trying to introduce a species to a new region. And here is the hippo factor that I discussed in the first module. So this 4 or 5 you need to remember, and why are they important? This, you say that this region has threat, but you just don't do it randomly. It is done with following this logic where you assess the level of threat. And we did this based on the change in the land proportion. And I had shown you 2 different scenario with calculation in my problem solving session. So in case you want to go, you can go back and check this problem solving session where I showed you that if you change the land by, let's say, 10% or 15%, how much species loss do you see and why that becomes important. Consider the type of land that you're looking into. 0.27% loss might not look very difficult or it's okay, but when you consider it to be part of the tropical rainforest where you have which is very speciose, 0.27 means 27,000 species loss, is that becomes very, very important. So this we discussed about how do we look into the threat and how we assess that it is threat or not. And then these are the different conservation methods that I just discussed. Ex situ is taking them out of their place. In situ is basically conserving them in the region that they are already found. And now, so if you go back here, in a ex situ, you are taking them out of the regions. So zoological park, botanical gardens. This is okay. This is something that you are doing outside. So you are already you are already capitalizing your or maximizing the benefits that you can get. So you have made the proper housing facility, proper feeding capacity. You have already thought about that when you are making a zoological park, because you are anyway decided that you take away animal from their place and keep it here. You house them here. But what happens in situ conservation? What do you do when you are thinking that okay, we'll conserve where they are found? How do you do that? How do you ensure that you are making a reserve that suffices their survivability and also doesn't become too much of a problem for us, right? So each of these methods, in situ, ex situ, have their own advantage and disadvantage, and you do please remember to take a look into them. So this is important because right now what I said here is, let's say this biosphere reserve. How do you design a biosphere reserve? Follows set of principles. These are those principles. But what you can remember as a key is that all these reserves, or all these efforts of conserving biodiversity, wildlife particularly, they focus on connectivity of these species. Anything and everything that you see for conservation of wildlife, you will see that they are mostly focused on building connectivity between the land masses so that it facilitates movement of animals. So you want the animal to keep moving and not be isolated. So all your designs, all your methods look particularly into the animal movement and how do you ensure that they are moved. And when I say movement, I obviously plant don't move, but if you have connectivity between land masses of two different plants, the pollinators can move and help in the diversity. So that's again movement of animals and by building corridors or connectivity. All these that you see, the principles are basically talking about that, right? Now, coming to the human perspective here, why do we do this? Why are even we bothered about conservation? Why are we even thinking about investing so much? That's because all the services that you get from ecosystem have their value. They are all possible. There's possibility of putting values to all of those services and generate revenue. And you can see from the perspective of value as well, that by conserving these ecosystem services is important, right? This we have done later also when this becomes more apparent and extensive when we look into human geography. This is we're going to discuss in the next part. So, yes, concluding this last module of the first part of this course, you can see that there are few topics, unfortunately, which I couldn't put here. Let me highlight this here so that it becomes easy when you look into the lecture notes. The first one here is talking about deterministic factor. Deterministic factor becomes important when you are looking into the population growth, and you need to understand population growth rate because you are trying to increase the survivability. You want the numbers to be retained of the biodiversity, but how are those determined, how are the numbers maintained, is because of population growth rate. And when you see a population growth rate, or you try to understand how the population grows, there are several factors that affect the population growth, and they are broadly classified into deterministic and stochastic. Simply remember, conditions that you can control are deterministic, conditions that it cannot control are stochastic. And both these type of factors affect the population growth in any region. Okay. And what I haven't discussed in addition to this is the last question on this slide, which is the set of species, which is basically the kind of species that you would like to save or protect or conserve. Now, there are so many species on the planet, and of course all of them have their own risk of level of risk, own associated problems. But when you want to conserve something, as I said, you want to maximize the effort. So these are the kind of species that generate the main attention. You have keystone species which does this absolutely essential ecosystem service. So you want to save an ecosystem, look into the conservation of the species. Indicator species, you have umbrella species, you have flagship species which gain more attention from the public. So if you have more attention, people become more aware, people try to contribute in their own ways, so they garner more human attention. So that you might want to save species which falls under flagship species that will make the effort more fruitful. So that's all upon the call that you take for conservation method. Next, The first one here is what I could not discuss, but I discussed the broad terminology for its ecosystem service. Ecosystem service, if you break down the name, it says that anything, any service that you receive from the ecosystem. Now, they could be supporting service, that is basically they are supporting some kind of phenomena. There is they are regulating something, they are giving you some properties, giving you some products to it, which is of course there is provisioning, and then there are cultural and social attachments to the biodiversity. That's cultural service. And all these surveys, as I said, can be put value to it. There were a series of 3 to 4 slides which showed you how to put values on all of these surveys. So this highlights that ecosystems are providing us with a lot of service in many different ways. Right now, 8th follows the same suit, 10th follows the same suit. Look at ninth again highlights why you should remember the definitions or at least the features of all of these different terms that we use. Habitat loss, habitat degradation, habitat displacement, habitat fragmentation have been extensively used during the course of this given the all the different problem solving sessions. And even though they look very similar to each other, degradation looks similar to displacement and fragmentation, they all mean something very different. So that's why this image is here. It's basically we have of course discussed this in the problem solving session. Look at this image there. Look at the focal species and look at the background, and then try to understand which kind of loss we are talking about, or which kind of effect we are talking about, or is the habitat degraded, or it is displaced, or which is fragmented. What is exactly happening here? One thing I forgot to mention, all my questions in this session are new questions. None of these questions were discussed in the previous session. So you have set of new questions here that we are discussing. So this was discussed in the problem solving session, but I did not make a question out of it. Right. And we now come to the second part of this course, and we'll go over this so that we finish in time, which we should because we are well within the time. Right. So the next set as I said, that the previous module's last chapter gave a turn towards human perspective, and now we are going to look into human perspective for different of these resources, and we will see how they are all connected to each other. So now we want to start by looking at human and conservation. We will start by first understanding why have human impacted because of their sheer number. So why is there this increase in number? And once we know that this increase is not going at a pace that it should be, we start with the measures already, and we start by looking into sustainable development. Right? Now, human geography, again, I have given this slide just for you to know that human geography in itself consists of several other phenomena. You can break it down and study separate aspect of human geography if you want to. Right? Now, when you look into this perspective of humans and geography, why are we even putting it in the second section? Because of two terms: naturalization of humans and humanization of nature. So naturalization of humans is basically saying that humans are becoming, more dependent on nature. They are trying to naturalize their way. And the second is talking about humanizing of nature, where people are now changing the nature according to their wishes. And this second term is problematic because this leads to whole issues that we are going to discuss. When you talk about the relationship of how human looks at environment, there are three domains which were discussed: environmental determinism, possibilism, and neo-determinism, which all talk about different perspectives that humans hold for the nature around himself. Now, when you do that, as I said, you start with looking into human population growth. But before that, to understand growth rate, you need to first look into the distribution of human. Now, when you look into this image, one thing becomes very clear, that human distribution is not even. Some regions are densely populated, some regions are absolutely sparse. This is a scenario where it is more prominent, and which gives you the understanding that distribution density are driven by factors. Push and pull factor that we discussed for animals are applicable here to distribution of humans as well. And that is what we did when we looked into the lecture. We have push and pull factors, which are further divided into geographical, economic, and social factors, which enables people to migrate from one region to other. And if there is more migration into a region, that region becomes densely populated, and the ones that they are moving out from, that of course shows a skewed population rate, right? Now, when you look into the population growth rate, there are two different concepts: exponential concept, exponential growth, and ecologistic growth. Logistic growth tells you why human growth is problem. Even exponential tells you, but logistic makes it more apparent to you. Logistic says that there is only a certain carrying capacity that the ecosystem can handle, and if population growth rate is not checked or controlled, then this overshoots, and then it becomes problem. That means that for an increased number of human population, you don't have that many resources. So that is where the discrepancy comes up, and that is why you need to focus on sustainable development, where we looked into sustainable development, weak sustainable development, strong sustainable development. In sustainable development, you focus on social, environment, and economic, all these three perspectives. And these here on the right are the 17 agendas that are put forward for sustainable development of the globe. So these questions cover what we have already discussed. Here, one thing that I did not discuss was Malthus, which was discussed extensively in the lecture series. Malthus basically talked about population growth rate, and then he talked about uh, how are population controlled by itself, and how do you control the population growth rate. So exponential growth rate and carrying capacity or logistic growth rate, Malthus said it is growing exponentially, but there are checks which are provided by the nature, and that were of two types again: preventive, and the other type which was positive. So this is not like, that's not what we discussed today anymore. We are don't They don't align with us, but this was just to lay the basics for the actual growth rate that we study, right? And again, if you look at the first question, this talks about the population dynamics, and this again comes, as we have read about population growth, it also turns up in this part of the this, in this part of the model. Okay, and the other questions have all been discussed, even though I've tried to keep it very short. Right. Now, quickly, let's move on. There are three modules that cover human geography. One, we started with by looking, okay, humans are present on Earth. How are they present? And what is the rate of population growth? In this module, we're going to actually see all these different distribution. Why are there different distribution? And what are humans actually using from the earth? We are saying humans have over consumed half of the things on this planet. We will now see what are these different kind of resources. We have already seen them as it is, how they are present on earth. Now we are going to connect them with human and see what have humans done and why are they over extensively used. So we look into land resources, we look into water resources, and we look into the mineral and energy resources. So when you look into the land resources or any resource for that matter, we are basically focused on the natural resource, because natural resource are further classified in renewable and non-renewable, and we keep using the non-renewable ones and then get extinct. So you won't have just a second. Yeah. And so you will not have resources left for the future generation, and that conscious effort you can start taking from now, and that topic is connected here in the reserve resources. So natural resources are divided into renewable, non-renewable, but they're also divided into four other categories, which are based on the usage and keeping for future: actual, potential, stock, and reserve. So you need to remember which, and there's some examples which are also given in the lecture. What are the resources type you are referring to? Okay. Now, let's come to the land resource that we were discussing. So, land resource is basically, now we're going to look at how are people using land actually. Just a second. Sorry about that. So we're gonna see that we have looked into land, right? We know how lands have formed and how different kind of soils are there. Now we're going to actually see what are those soil used for in different parts of the globe. And this map here shows you exactly that. Some of the places are being extensively used for boreal system, but some are used for pastoral and some are used for agriculture. And these are the places where you have over use of this land for different purposes, and that gives rise to problems. And we looked into many different ways of what are these land used for. We had looked into different kind of food crops that we use, different kind of land use for uh, fish products, meat products, several categories of products. How are you using the land and who is using the most, right? So for land, we already know what kind of landforms we have because we have had the discussion, and then we now look into how the humans are using these different part of land. Then similar concept for water. We look at what kind of water you have on earth and what are people using it for. And then we also looked into different ways of conserving water, either by reducing the wastage, increasing the recharge, or saving the water bodies around us. So water basically explained, or when water lecture we looked into different forms of water that are being used by humans. And the term if you remember was used was water withdrawal. Who have extensive water withdrawal and where are they used mainly, and how can you combat the negative effects of it. And then once we looked into the conservation method for water, we also looked for conservation of land. And again, you have different ways of doing that. You can let it be, or you can consciously make effort to enhance the quality of the land. So you have land enhancement. You can plant something else and replace it, so to increase the productivity of the land, that's enhancement. And replacement, you can restore the land to its previous version, that's restoration. Or you can rehabilitate by giving it feature, or you can help by putting some manures or giving some nutrients to rehabilitate it. So these are different ways of conserving water and land resources that were discussed. And then we looked into the usage of minerals. Basically, where do you find the mineral, and what are we using the minerals for, and how have we overused it such that it impacts the land and water, right? So here the questions that you see, they are basically mostly in the form of definition, because this entire module here was mostly about defining the usage of words. You have all these different you know uh, definitions that are associated with resources and how they are used. Okay. And that brings me to the last section of the human geography and the second last section of this course, which is economic geography. So you have now see the connection. You know humans are present, so you have understood where humans are present, why humans are present, how they are increasing. Next you see, okay, humans are present in some region. They are present uh, extensively in one region and sparsely in the other. Now let's look at those regions and see how they are using the resources. So what resources? You see them using land, you see them using water, you see them using minerals. Now you know a sustainable way of using this, but you have seen overconsumption. That's one. Now you're going to see how other aspects, which is not based on using, but other aspects of human geography impact conservation or impact the nature. And in that we looked into transport and communication system, we looked into trade, and then we looked into settlement. Now these are applications of the resources that have been used, and we now look into how those applications are deemed as problems. So first is transport network. So people over the globe are now connected with each other with several mode of transport networks, be it airways, waterways, roadways. Roadways have their own railroads and cars. Now increased networks, of course, one way is that it's increasing pollution, but the other most prominent effect of transportation is wildlife. So, and with this, there was a very important concept which was about barrier effect. If you remember, barrier effect is basically talking about the impact of cars or usage of road in between forest patch on the moving or the crossing of animal. So it's basically talking about one patch of road in between two forest lands. Now, if there is less of car, it's okay. The animals can cross from one region to another. If there is very high car number, then the animals will not cross, and that leads to other problem which is related to all the population being isolated and their population going down. But there is one patch in between of this, in the center of this map, that is deadly trap. This is where the numbers are not too high for the animals to recognize that okay, I should not cross the road, and that's when you have most of the road kills or human wildlife conflict. Animals are run over and that leads to their death, which is very scary and very problematic. So this is one of the most apparent effect of transportation on natural ecosystem. You have so many wildlife related deaths, right? And that calls for immediate mitigations, immediate procedures that you should take to overcome and bypass these problems. One of them is such kind of passes. You have underpass or you can have overpass. Along with this, we had discussed about, if you remember, glider poles. We had discussed about culverts. So all these are basically saying that trying to conserve the biodiversity because of human intervention and human related issues. Now that was about transport. That's easy to understand. Next was trade, where we had international trade and national domestic trade. We looked into so many perspective of trade. Why do we do trade? When does it become important? Why do we go for trade? You remember we looked into when the trade becomes inevitable, obvious, and optional. What are the modes of comparisons that we draw? But when you talk about conservation, you can imagine why it becomes important, because more trade or more the demand for trade means more the demand for the products, more the demand for the product, more the usage of land and water resources and mineral resources, and that is where the highlight, which is what highlights the important issues related to trade. And then lastly, we have discussed about settlements, which is basically how humans are staying or present, and that's okay if they stay nearby or isolated. What is problematic is urban sprawl, which is the thing that was discussed, basically urbanization. Now you can imagine increased urbanization with basically usage of more resources, usage of more land space, less nature around you. So urban sprawl is what is the problem related to the settlement. So all the problems have now been highlighted, and when we looked into the other two, trade, the solution to that, the problem there is to make conscious efforts and to understand which one is eco-friendly and sustainable way. When we looked into the first one, which is transport, we have already looked into the mitigation way. Now let's look into the mitigation of settlements, and that's sustainable development model or sustainable settlement model. If you go back to my problem solving session, you will see I have extensively discussed exactly what this model is trying to show with respect to sustainable settlement. Why is this sustainable, and how are the things being reused and recycled? So this is a mitigation, or this is a step that can be taken to bypass or overcome the issues related to settlement. Okay, and the questions here, there are 2 3 things that I would like to highlight because this topic here was more on economic geography. There were a lot of things about trading that we had learned here, so you need to be careful about those topics. So the first one, but I would like to highlight, I've spoken about settlements, and when you look into settlements of humans, you will see there are many kind of settlements. You have village settlement, you have these like hamlet settlements and isolated settlement, and then you have towns and cities. Towns are basically divided or classified based on their density, their number, their main attraction or their main referent. For example, we had seen about, so there was a slide, if you remember, which gave all these different towns name based on their property. Some town like, Kota is for educational town, or some town like Bhilai is more of an industrial town. So you had several categories of such towns, and all of them had their own example. And you need to at least remember what are the different kinds of town. This is the district classification of town based on their most apparent phenomena or most apparent feature. Class town is also divided and classified based on their number of people residing there. So that's also important. That will come in the next slide. And the other thing that I want to highlight was this, the fifth one. Fifth one is related to the type of trade that we had seen, right? We had seen that in one case it was the solution was trade has to be done, so trade is inevitable. In the other, we had seen the trade is obvious, and then we had third one, we had seen trade can be optional, but it depends on the comparative advantage, where we looked into if the farmer looks into the opportunity cost of that product, how does he fare? And this question here, or this table here, was discussed in the problem solving session in the lectures. And based on this table, you can determine which farmer will go for what kind of trade, right? So this you do please look into. And then, as I mentioned, the first question here talks about the classification, and then all the others we have already discussed so far, right? And that brings me and with an end to the this course. And you can say check here that these topics are all additional topics that are not directly related to the human geography or the first part that we had discussed about biodiversity, but these are topics that add on to our knowledge of the other 11 topics that we have just read. Here we are discussing about remote sensing and GIS and how do we use them for understanding the biodiversity. We look into disaster, which has a great impact on humans and biodiversity, and how do we mitigate those which phenomena. And lastly, remember I spoke about ecosystem services valuation. This is topic that extensively looks into how do you evaluate all these different natural resources. So, in the first, where we had looked into remote sensing, we looked into what kind of remote sensing we are talking about, active, passive. We had LIDAR discussion. We also discussed what are the principles, what is the basic principle behind remote sensing, which basically talked about that you're trying to get images. Basically it's all about photography, so you're trying to get images but from a distinct location. When I discussed about the atmospheric layer, I talked about the satellites there, and with respect to remote sensing, so these satellites are stationed outside the troposphere, and from there they capture the image, give back to the system, which interprets it for different usage like these kind of maps, or building models out of this, which is basically building products out of this. The whole suite of tools that utilizes this information are GIS. So that also we had discussed, and why are we using them. Basically these kind of map tells you where do you have more biodiversity, where do you have greenery, where do you have more urban places, right? And then we looked into disaster. So we had covered this part, which basically relates to human geography or conservation geography, because it gives you an idea about where to look for if you want to look for places to conserve, which is more heavily degraded, which habitat is more heavily impacted. So that was about the first thing. The second thing is about disaster. Is basically disaster also is a force that impacts the diversity around us, but this is not under our control. If it is a natural disaster, if it's a man-made disaster, that is under our control. But for any disaster, knowing that the disaster is happening is not enough. You need to be prepared for it as well as mitigate it, and then be ready to respond and recover. So how do you overcome and how do you prepare for a disaster is all like dependent on how aware you are of the situation. And for this we had looked into these different four steps or stages which are part of disaster management cycle, and we extensively looked into what we do in each of these different stages. For example, preparedness is basically keeping yourself ready for disaster. It comes and I will start acting towards it, so I'm preparing. Mitigating, preparedness is basically taking account of all the problem. Mitigation is making a step towards it. So let's say you build a strong wall, you bring parapets to and restrict entry of flood. So you are making conscious efforts. Then you have disaster, the actual incident, and then response is what you are immediately doing right at the moment of a disaster, and that how successful your response depends on your preparedness and your mitigation. And lastly, you have recovery, which is about how do you recover from the losses, how quickly do you do this, and how quickly do you get ready for your normal cycle. So those were all discussed in disaster management cycle. And the last lecture was, as I had said, that it talks about putting value to all these different services and biodiversity usage. So the usage, if you remember, they can have direct use, indirect use. Indirect use you can have direct use or indirect use basically come under use. You are using the resources in one form or the other, directly or indirectly, and all these usage have their own values. But there are also values which are not depending on use. So there you are not using the plant, you are not using the animal, but there are values which are associated in this regard. For example, their existence is a value, their being the idea of keeping these resources for our future generation, that itself is a value, and all this value can be given a numeric term to it, and that's by all these three different methods. And what the underlying idea here is that you can give value to all the resources and all the services that ecosystem does, and you can analyze that if you want to raise down a region for creating something or building a space for yourself, might want to take a step back, look into what is exactly the cost of this entire thing, how much cost do you have to pay if you're raising these entire part down, and how much cost do you pay comes from what services the natural fauna flora is providing to the nature and the world. And then see if you're investing or if you're spending more than what you're going to get in return of that region, and take conscious efforts of not destroying the habitat around you. So all of these basically try to highlight that why biodiversity is important. And in disaster management, just for you to be clear, there was this 12 terms that were discussed with perspective of how they are related to disasters. Terms like, if you remember, capacity, terms like in critical infrastructure, contingency planning, hazardous event. So these are different. They are not all disaster. There are some which are preluding disaster. There are some which leads to disaster. So you need to be very clear and like objective about what you are trying to define here. And with that idea only, I had put all of these different definitions here, so that it gives you a good reminder and good exercise for you to remember those words. Okay. And yeah, and when you are looking into the valuation of the ecosystem service, remember there are three methods. I'll go back to the slide just to show you once again. You have market prices, circumstantial, and service. And I had explained in the last problem solving session what does all of these mean, and when do you use this, and how is it so practical when you actually go into the site, right? Yes. So that brings an end to this course and to my entire problem solving sessions. These are the answer keys for all the questions that I have asked for all the different modules. You can look into the recordings and try to solve it and come back and check your answer. I'm pretty sure you will get through it. And just to summarize once again, we have looked into 12 modules. We've looked into 36 lectures. Today also we discussed multiple questions, and we have covered all these different topics that were discussed in the lecture. So with this, I'd like to finish the session today and the problem solving self sessions in general. I hope you helped you understand the course better, and today's course at least gave you a mind map of understanding what the course works and how do you study it when you are revising it. And all the best for your exams, those who are giving the exams, and it's not a difficult exam at all. And just revise those questions which are part of the assignments, which are part of your problem solving sessions, and it should be easy for you. And the ones who are not taking exam, I hope this course uh, provided you with the understanding of why is it important to conserve the biodiversity around us, and why should we think before doing anything about the nature around us, and how important it is for us and for the well-being of the planet. And with that, I'd like to end this session. If you have any doubt, please let me know. Otherwise, all the best for your future. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.